Welcome back to the This is going to be a blooper for this week. It's got to be. Oh, right. Welcome back to the Value Exchange podcast, episode 6. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Dan Richardson, a nutritionist, where we're going to talk about everything plant-based nutrition. Dan's worked in elite sport for around 7 years, is that right? Yeah, with the likes of Leeds, Manchester City, Nottingham Forest, Sale Sharks, and more. He's also worked as a nutrition consultant for the University of Manchester, the University of Oxford, and is now a visiting lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. The list continues. Dan, welcome to the podcast. That is some CV.
Thanks. I'm impressed that you managed to reel off so many of them as well. Kind of gets embarrassing, doesn't it, when you plug that into 7 years? But a lot of my work is consultancy. So as much as there's names on there, a lot of it is trying to go into clubs and making a bit of a difference. And whether that be through one-to-one support, educational workshops is kind of my main route of, I suppose, nutrition in terms of just developing and almost knowledge exchanging in the way that your podcast is doing. So hopefully we can dive into some of those topics today.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one. Nutrition is I've got a little bit of a background in nutrition as well. I just want to start with your educational background because these days, there's so many people online that are coaches, nutritionists, etc., spreading a lot of misinformation. So it can be quite challenging to, find out what information is actually real. What information should I follow? He's saying do this, she's saying don't do this. It can be a bit confusing. So I just want to start with your educational background, because when people watch this, we know that, Dan has got these qualifications, he's done this work with these people. You know what you're talking about, essentially. So tell us a little bit about your educational background.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you in what you're saying there in regards to online information, especially around nutrition and the explosion of some of the characters that we're seeing in the, I suppose, series of Instagram and TikTok and all of the information that's going out around there. And 90% of my time, specifically with parents, is debunking those myths or answering those questions often when I'm going into clubs. But yeah, my background is really kind of in sport, and that's why I'm kind of more of a sports nutritionist than a health-based practitioner, I suppose. So I wanted to be a rugby player when I was younger. I realised that wasn't going to happen. A small conversation in the car with my dad when I'd kind of hit the age of, I think it was around 17, and had been offered to stay on at the local kind of professional club as a what they called like a rookie or a semi-pro contract. And I can't remember the exact number of what they'd offered me, but it was something like 50 quid or 40 quid a week to stay on there or go off to university and study. So during that time I was doing a BTEC, nothing wrong with BTECs. I've somehow made a career being a BTEC warrior in sport and exercise science, which was always an interesting one to try and navigate when you got to Durham University and everyone else had done A-levels. So I went off to Durham University, studied a sports science degree, and then from there really kind of give up the rugby to some extent, just playing it recreationally, and realised that I wanted to be a practitioner in sport. Probably not until maybe second or third year at university had I decided nutrition was the career path I wanted to take. I'd toyed with the idea of going down a master's in physio or potentially S&C, but what I'd realised is that there was a lot of that coming into the industry and a lot of people wanting to be an S&C and physio. And at the time, nutrition was that up-and-coming topic that there was a little bit of rumblings online. There was a few people that were calling themselves nutritionists, but there wasn't really that kind of mass explosion that we've seen recently around nutrition. So then I went off to Manchester Metropolitan, where I go back and guest lecture now, but I went and did my master's degree in sports nutrition for a year there. And then from there, just went on to kind of go and work in professional sports and do it the hard way. Lots of internships, lots of low-paying roles, but ultimately, kind of reaping the rewards, I suppose, as a consultant now and being able to make a real impact with lots of different athletes, parents, and of course, coaches as well.
There's a couple of things I want to pick up on there. So I guess you've always been involved in sport, whether that's playing or, studying BTECs, doing your undergrad, then your master's degree. What's it like? Because obviously you said you studied at MMU and now you go back and you actually teach on the course that you studied. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I teach across the nutrition modules, so a little bit in the undergrad and a little bit in the masters, and then I've done a small amount on the sport and exercise medicine course as well, which has been quite interesting and I suppose a bit of a challenge for me to go back from being a student to then being somebody who's almost like, I don't want to say living proof because it sounds like I'm patting my own back, but living proof that this course might potentially be something that you can go on and have a career in. I think one of the realities that I try and give back to the students, because I don't think it's fair to come in and almost, strutting in a kit and say, this is what you're going to end up being. It's almost trying to pinpoint the fact that it doesn't mean that doing this course means you're going to become successful. And I'm kind of, I suppose, living proof of that you've got to go and do the internships, the unpaid work and the hours to kind of be able to build that up. But it's really nice to go back and meet, kind of what I was maybe 6-7 years ago, however long it was now, and kind of realize that there's people that are still as passionate as what I was back then to go and get a career in it. And I think the nice thing is it builds my network as well. So there's a couple of the nutritionists that have recently come out of MMU that are now doing some part-time consultancy with myself at some of the clubs that I work at. So it's just a nice pool of talent that I can pick from to kind of bring into my side of things in terms of the real world and the professional side of sports nutrition.
Because I guess, like you say, it is a talent pool. You get to identify, okay, who's got potential here, who's working as hard as I was back then, who really wants it, because
Absolutely.
That can be the challenge sometimes at university. Some people are there to go on and do well like yourself, and some people are not, like one foot in, one foot out, are there to kind of prolong the teenage years, etc., etc. Yeah. We probably shouldn't get into that. Something else you said, something you're doing with working with parents of these athletes, you're debunking a lot of myths. What are some of the, let's say the common myths, let's say top two common myths that you keep hearing about, things that people are hearing online?
Yeah, I think the top two really is the creatine kind of, I want to call it a scandal, I reckon is the best way of describing it. And rightly so, at a younger age, it is absolutely not required for athletes or any person. But we see a lot of research in slightly older populations of young athletes. So we're talking like 16 to 18 and beyond, and how it can benefit in terms of their performance. But what a lot of parents have still got an association with is almost that creatine is a steroid. And that's obviously not true. Creatine's a natural source of, I suppose, a source of a nutrient that we can get through meats. However, I think the maths is, and I might be mistaken, I think it's around 2.5 kilograms of salmon is equivalent to a 5-gram scoop of creatine. Realistically, no kid's going to eat 2.5 kilograms of salmon. So often parents will ask me, like, what are the dangers of creatine, and they'll almost preload the question with why shouldn't my child who's 17 in a rugby academy take creatine? I've heard that creatine causes hair loss or stunts growth or is bad for your liver and kidneys, and we could break down, if you wanted to, some of the where that comes from, and there is some, I suppose, truth in that, but obviously as the internet does and as the kind of general media do, they kind of twist and turn research to make sure that it portrays the message to get the clicks. If you see something that creatine is a 100% safe supplement for all those 16 and beyond in professional sport, probably not going to click on that. But if there's a tagline that says research finds that creatine causes hair loss in all males regardless of sport, that's the first thing you're going to click towards. So I'd say that's probably myth number one that I get a lot. And I think the rise of some of the social media stars, should we call them, that are coining themselves as nutritionists or health practitioners is probably the other one. So I won't say some of the names of them, but there's one that was recently very much, I suppose, eating lots of meat and having like a caveman diet. And we're saying that you could look like him if you did that and went down that route. And you had kids believing, more so than the parents, that they needed kind of like raw livers and kidneys to eat and chicken breasts and all the rest of it. And then, it turns down the line that actually this kind of influencer, should we call him, went and did a drugs test because he was trying to prove to everyone that he wasn't taking anything, and the drugs test came back positive. He's then sat there on his little throne saying, I'm really sorry, you can't actually look like me if you just eat the food that I'm telling you to, because I've kind of unnaturally enhanced myself to get to that position. And one of the other ones, I think, and not so much kind of myths, because that's more of I suppose, a story of someone, is the conversation around processed and unprocessed foods. And that comes as well a lot from social media, kind of pushing certain things. Like recently, crumpets and oats have been added to kind of like a TV banned advert list, if you didn't know already. And that obviously scares a lot of parents, because oats is like a staple of any athlete's breakfast, and crumpets or bread can be quite a staple of any athlete's snack for high carbs. But it's to do with the sugar and salt content within those products themselves. So it's more so around that you look on, BBC News, and again, the click title is oats and crumpets have been barred from TV adverts. But actually, when you read into it, it's oats that have got added sugars, not just like your standard Scots porridge oats or whatever it might be. Yeah, we're all right there. But again, parents don't read the full description. So I had a lot of parents saying, I've just seen recently that oats have been banned, and you can't have oats anymore. And I'm like, where's this come from? Quick Google search, find the article, and then when you read through it, it's more around that like they're equivocal in terms of their sugars and salts to the cereals that are banned on TV adverts. So what they've now done is said, well, those oats that have got added sugar and added salts, we can't have advertised on TV. Doesn't mean they're bad for athletes, because we need that source of energy. And often it's quick kind of sources of energy that we need to get in. For example, that's much better than skipping breakfast. We're not going to make, avocado, sourdough toast and poached eggs every morning for our young athletes. So it's what can we get that's just as good? And again, parents often come with me with, I've seen this product should never be consumed by an athlete, and it's often something that the kind of mainstream media or social media spat out at them from that perspective.
Yeah, wow. So 3 main myths there. I guess firstly, I have oats every morning.
I think you're all right.
But I do agree, a lot of it's just for the titles to get people to click and read. Yeah. But a lot of people don't click and read, they just read the title. Yeah, so that's where your job comes in, to debunk a lot of these myths.
Absolutely.
And is that what you spend quite a lot of your time doing then? Are people, I imagine, parent of an athlete, they want to help them, they want to support them, they might not have that nutrition education themselves, so they go to online, they search in, but they don't know where to search and get the evidence-based information from. So they're just coming to you with BBC News articles and Instagram, TikTok information. And then that probably just makes your job, instead of, we're going to focus on this education, we're going to spend a lot of time debunking these myths.
Yeah, a lot of time, myths and education are the 2 big things that I spend, especially in the youth population. I think with adult athletes, they've seen it all, they've grown up through it. If you're kind of working with somebody that's kind of in their late 20s, they probably tried all the myths when they were 10 years younger at 15, 16, realised that they don't work, and have become a bit immune, I suppose, to seeing the myths. But often a first parent into sport with little knowledge. And what we've got to understand with parents as well is they're not always health practitioners or doctors or nurses or people that understand that. A lot of the times they just have day-to-day jobs, and realistically 9 times out of 10, if not more, the parents will be I work in the construction industry, I don't have a clue about nutrition, and I have a bacon butty every morning, but I know my son shouldn't be having that. So 9 times out of 10, I think, in like parent catch-ups that I do at a lot of the clubs that I work at, quite often they become a kind of dispelling of myths. And then at the Q&A part of any kind of workshop, there's always 1 or 2 myths. And often when a parent says it, I see a bunch of other parents in the room start nodding their heads and thinking, that's a good myth, actually, I've heard that. And it's interesting how the minute you debunk it and make sense of it, it kind of goes away. It's not something that they hang on to as fact. They just want to know whether they're keeping it in the brain and using it as knowledge, or they're just tossing it away and letting it go in one ear and out the other, which, like I say, most of the time, there is evidence to suggest or back up the opposite side, that it is a myth and it's not something that we should believe as fact, which is always helpful knowing my research as well. I think I spend a lot of time making sure that if I see something come out, for example, the BBC News article around crumpets and oats, actually in detail understanding that and working out why that's happened, and then being able to give a logical answer back to parents instead of just coming back to them saying, yeah, that's a myth. I have to debunk it. I have to have the research to back it and get them to kind of understand that research as well.
No, I love that. And like you say, you need that evidence before you proved, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for you to prove, well, why is that wrong? So that must be a big part of your work. I guess just for this episode, I'm going to try and define at least plant-based in how we're going to speak about it, and sport in how we're going to speak about it, because I think there's a lot of plant-based diets. Some exclude cheese, some exclude meat. For the purpose of this episode, I'm going to say, as we talk about plant-based diets, it's excluding any animal products, meat, fish, dairy, and sports. I'd want to focus on maybe one or two sports. I think we should focus on running, and we can either focus on like a high rocks, or like a rugby, which is probably one of your
I think we've got for a team sport.
Yeah. So let's say running and rugby, just for the purpose of this episode, because I think if I'm asking you questions about sport, you can say, well, for running, probably beneficial. For this other sport, or maybe, and it's hard to then actually get an understanding of what we're speaking about. So for the purpose of the episode, we'll talk about running and rugby. And plant-based diet is anything that excludes animal products. So I think we've covered kind of what your role is as a performance nutritionist, and you've given us kind of what you do. But what does a typical day in the life look like? Because we've had a bit of a chat before the episode, and you're busy. You're like super busy. So tell us.
So yeah, a day in the life for me, probably a lot of miles, as we discussed earlier. I think travelling up and down to different clubs, different areas, often tends to be what I get up to. I think majority of the time, regardless how I try and dress it up, it's education. I work a lot in the youth sports space, a little bit in kind of the professional sports space as well, but even so, it's still education regardless, and they can come in different forms of webinars, workshops, one-to-one, small group catch-ups, however that might look. So I suppose typical day for me, I'd say as a nutritionist, a decent breakfast in the morning is always a go-to. You'd be glad to know that I also have oats as well, so we're both in trouble there with the new band adverts. But an overnight oats is typically what I'll eat first thing in the morning, just to get me going and get me ready to go. Recently jumped on, I suppose, the life hack of not having your coffee as soon as you wake up, and actually delaying that slightly. So I'll often go for an electrolyte-based drink with salts in to make sure that I'm getting rehydrated from a long night's sleep. And then I'll be on the road, or I'll be wherever I might be. So typically if I'm, going over to where I live in Huddersfield up to Leeds, I'll be driving quite early morning to try and miss the rush hour of traffic, try and get a gym session in at whichever club that I'm going to at that time. And then typically it's a mixture really of kind of working with the team behind the team. So, in multidisciplinary meetings, discussing players, pathways, and supporting them specifically around kind of how we can better them from a potential body composition point of view. So that meaning like your lean mass, your body fat percentage, and your overall weight, comparing that especially in like the youth sports space to the kind of, I suppose, role models to an extent that they might aspire to be in the first team. So a really good example is, typically speaking, a centre back in the championship is between kind of 80 to 90 kilograms. But actually we can break that down at the, whichever squad I might be working with, as to which player you most like within that first team, and how can we make sure that your nutrition is in place to be able to go on and develop that. Normally, again, that'll come through multiple interventions of sitting down one-to-one and actually mapping out that process and helping them pick the right foods. And then from there, I suppose, a lot of education workshops in and around the country. So like yesterday, I spent the daytime at Leeds United at one of the clubs that I work at, doing a lot of work around like the one-to-ones. We actually had our Christmas dinner, which was quite fun. So making sure that the lads enjoyed the Christmas dinner, but not too much, and kept a limit on the pigs in blankets and the desserts, but everything else was fair game. And then once I'd finished there, travelling across to St Helens Rugby Club to work with their under-19s pathway, women's side, talking all about kind of, I suppose, women's health in nutrition, but also how to fuel specifically as a rugby player for the day, and where you can get certain sources of foods from, portion sizes, etc. I suppose that kind of day-to-day is what my days look like. Some days are more weighted towards one-to-ones, others are more weighted towards I suppose, workshops, and then I get the odd opportunity to come on a podcast and switch off from work for a couple of hours to enjoy a conversation, which is always good fun.
Nice. What a day. A couple of things I'm going to pick on there. Firstly, your breakfast overnight oats, love that. I have that as well. But you said you have water with some salt, so an electrolyte drink. Why is it not enough to just have a glass of water? Why are you having it with electrolytes or salts?
That's a really good question. So if we think about the time period that we spend asleep, we don't, if we have the perfect night's sleep, so we have, we go to bed and we wake up and we have an 8-hour period, there's very little opportunity in those 8 hours or 8 to 9 hours that we should be getting where we can actually take a sip of water or drink or stay hydrated. Now, you imagine during the day, I know it's a little bit different because we're moving around and we're going around the place, but if you spent 8 hours without drinking any form of liquid, the body's going to be fairly dehydrated, regardless of how well you've prepped the body before those 8 hours. We're going to find a level of dehydration that we're not going to be able to eradicate with just water. A lot of people sweat during the night and don't realize it. I'm one of those that I don't wake up in the morning thinking, God, I need a shower this morning because I've sweated loads, but we know that we sweat during the night. So one of the big things for me is making sure I'm replacing what's lost through sweating. And also I'm quite cautious sometimes of if I drink too much water leading up to going to sleep, I'm going to be up and down to the toilet in the night. So again, knowing that I'm probably going to bed borderline hydrated, and as a nutritionist, obviously that should scare you because you're busy preaching it all day long and talking about that. So yeah, waking up in the morning and just replacing the sodium or the salts that are lost through sweating during the night, and it stops me jumping for a coffee. I think I do have a glass of water as well, or I'll take a bottle of water on the road with me depending how quick I'm out of the house. But knowing that water is not really going to satisfy me, I suppose, whereas like a coffee or a tea would, and knowing that actually I should wait because in terms of our systems, to keep it simple, our systems that actually utilize caffeine and help give us a boost of energy take around 90 minutes after our waking time to kick in. So it's pointless having a coffee as soon as we wake up. I used to be a classic in the car, eat my breakfast really quick, have my glass of water with without electrolytes in, and then coffee as soon as I get in the car. I've probably only been awake around 30-45 minutes at that point. So what I realized was for myself as well, and again trying to practice what you preach instead of being the practitioner that's that classic, do as I say, not as I do, and trying to lead by example is, well, I don't, I do like water, but I don't want water first thing in the morning. So let's have something with a bit of taste in it, like an electrolyte. And then that allows me to then progress to the coffee when it's ready to have. So that's probably my rationale behind it from my perspective. But again, you could have just water, but I feel as though hydration wouldn't be, I suppose, optimized at that point.
So we're looking at that from to achieve optimal hydration rather than just everyday people that are just waking up, not really too concerned whether they're hydrated. We're looking at that from, obviously, as well, practicing what you preach.
Yeah, and I think the biggest test as well is when you wake up in the morning, see what colour your urine is when you go for a morning wee. I can guarantee it's not, that translucent, clear, pale colour that we're after from a hydrated perspective. And it's not possible to do that unless you set an alarm like every couple of hours to get up and drink water, which would absolutely trash your sleep. So there'd be no point doing that. So it's then like, well, how can we try and get that back to optimal quicker? And, in all of my workshops and one-to-ones, I'm talking about using electrolytes to kind of support hydration and fluid balance. So why wouldn't, we bring it into everyday life as a nutritionist as well?
Yeah, cool. No, thank you for clearing that up.
Right.
And secondly, you work with a multidisciplinary team most of the time in these clubs. What other disciplinaries are you working with?
Yeah, really good question. I think like in an MDT, as it's shortened to, or multidisciplinary team, there is a lot of moving parts, I suppose. And a lot of people would kind of throw out the easy ones. Oh, well, you must work with a strength and conditioning coach or a physical development coach, depending on what club you're at and the title they hold. And a physiotherapist would be like the key ones. But actually, there's psychologists, there's head of medicals, there's coaches, assistant coaches, technical coaches, depending on clubs, they might have, like in rugby, an attacking and a defensive coach. And often what will happen is you'll split off into smaller multidisciplinary teams, i.e. the performance and medical team and then the coaching team. But then every now and again you will come together, or quite frequently you'll come together as a larger MDT group to discuss kind of conversations around players, because as much as my role within clubs where I work is very nutrition based, I also have to know what they want out of that player from the rugby demands or the footballing demands. So then I can, firstly, I suppose, tailor my approach and conversation with the athlete to ensure that they're happy with, why we're going after a certain metric, for example, increasing lean body mass and putting it into an action in their sport, like rugby. Well, actually, we want to see you make more line breaks, or we want to see you make, more meters gained if you're a prop forward or second row, for example. And that comes from knowing what the coach is working on them with in their like individual performance sessions. So the MDTs, obviously everybody encompassed as a big umbrella, but most of the time I find myself sat in that kind of performance department. So a lot of medical based staff, psychologists, physios, S&Cs, and then quite often, head of performances that oversee all of that as well and do a really good job of ensuring that we're all working in unison instead of in small little silos on our own. I think, sport can be quite a lonely place as a practitioner. If you're the only nutritionist at the club, it might be the case that you're somebody who is kind of working on nutrition on your own, but actually you need to make sure that you're doing all of the bits with all of the other departments as well to support, that holistic approach to performance.
Yeah, I imagine, the approach of other disciplines is going to inform your nutrition strategy, because it's not going to be the same. Even, you got that team sport, but it's going to be an individual approach sometimes. If, you got a player injured, an attacking player that you want to achieve X, a defending player you might want to achieve something else, so that probably informs that. Definitely. Something we hear a lot, evidence-based and food-first approach. This can be challenging because, as we said before, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of brands pushing supplements. You need to take this. This is going to elevate your performance. How do you manage that? Because obviously, is evidence-based food-first approach something you kind of push? And then what kind of challenges does that misinformation and latest supplements bring in?
Absolutely. I think it was in 2022, there was a really good paper that came out. I can't remember all the authors, but I know Graham Close was on there, who's a professor in kind of, I suppose, the nutrition space in sport. And the title of the paper was Food First, but Not Food Only. And I thought that was a perfect way of summarising it, because all the time at university, in my early days as a practitioner, everybody just wanted to know that you were a food first approach practitioner. And that was like the tagline that, I'm a food first approach nutritionist, always pushing food. But then what we realized was that there is often times where it's not always just food, and there is elements where we do need to have some form of supplements to be able to support, whether that's performance or potential health outcomes as well. So in, I suppose, a lot of my roles, it's always food first where possible, or, but not food only. And I think when it comes to consuming macronutrients, so carbs, fats, proteins, you have to, as a nutritionist and as the athlete, exhaust every possible avenue to ensure that we're getting it through foods. And interestingly, in one of my talks last night, this was a question that was asked around what's the difference between just having a protein shake after training versus having like a chicken breast or something else that's high in protein. And really interesting, because it was like, well, the protein shake's easier to get hold of, and I don't have to then have like a cold, like potentially half smelly chicken breast, was what the athlete was saying. And I was like, but ultimately that protein shake will hit your protein requirements, but that chicken breast has a lot more nutrients available in it. It's much more natural to the body, so it's going to be absorbed much better. But likewise, that's also going to be that we can add that into a wrap maybe, or potentially we put it into a small portion with rice or noodles, and that gives us more of like a small meal that's going to help recover us a lot better than just that singular shake. So I think there is a time and a place that supplements are beneficial. If we look at our vitamins and minerals, if we find we have a deficiency and we're struggling to get that through foods, or potentially we're following a specific diet that limits certain foods, then ultimately we might need to start looking to supplement. But typically speaking, if we're talking about the classic kind of protein shakes, do we need them or not? I do believe we can get them through foods. If we look at the requirements of athletes, obviously it varies depending on sport and what their gram per kilogram requirement is of protein. So a good example is in rugby, some athletes will be recommended 2 grams per kilogram. If they weigh 100 kilograms, they'll need to consume 200 grams of protein for the day. I believe that's possible through food if we're smart with our choices of snacks, meals, and the way that we balance it across the day. And then really, if we get to a point where we can't get any more food in and we're really struggling to hit that kind of marker consistently, then we might look towards adding a supplement or a protein shake in there. But that obviously spirals the conversation of at what age do we look to start using supplements? And ideally, we stay food first as a minimum to 16, and then that 16 to 18 period is always that, in quotations, it depends on the circumstance of the athlete, where they're at with their growth and development, and kind of pushing forward from there.
No, this is a perfect segue, because obviously you're saying you try and exhaust all them food options first.
Yeah.
When people are following certain diets that exclude, a lot of major food groups, that becomes a lot more challenging from the bat, especially if they're trying to eat in a caloric surplus, or, they're trying to gain muscle mass. Yeah. The options are a lot more limited.
Absolutely.
So if we imagine someone on a plant-based diet, what are some of the common challenges they might face? If we think of a rugby player, for example, to make it a little bit easier, they're probably going to want to be quite high muscle mass.
Yeah.
They might have I imagine rugby's quite demanding for energy-wise. So what might some of the challenges that they face as a rugby player?
Absolutely, and I think, like you say, a really nice segue into plant-based eating. And for me, plant-based diets get a lot of bad rap. They've had good rap in the past, don't get me wrong. There was that documentary, I think it was Game Changers on Netflix. We won't delve into that because that could be a second episode. But at that time, I was working at a rugby club, and a lot of lads came in. And interesting was like, right, I'm vegan now. And I was like, how so? Oh, well, I watched this documentary where they'd hand-selected certain athletes that had done well and had actually managed their plant-based diet very well. And these athletes were coming in. I was like, okay, so what have you brought in for your lunch today then? Well, I brought a salad with a couple of pieces of tofu. And then one of the other lads said, I've just got a bag of baby spinach, and I'm going to eat that because they're my new crisps now because I'm vegan. I was like, all right, okay. So they weren't thinking about their fueling. And I think a lot of athletes, when they make that decision, don't take the steps necessary to be prepared for the eventuality that they're going to have to still get the macro and micronutrients in. Protein still exists even for a plant-based athlete, and you can still get it in through foods. Now, thankfully, with the advancements of certain products and brands that have been able to make ranges in supermarkets that are plant-based, it's much more easier than what it used to be. I think I'm going back to 2018, 19, where maybe it wasn't as big or as well known. And year on year, we see more products coming out and more foods and availability of plant-based foods. I think the big one's always protein. So regardless whether you're a runner or you're a rugby player, your protein intake's still going to be important. We know that we need to hit muscle protein synthesis, and there's a threshold to that, but in a fancy way, that's the regrowth and repair of muscles. And we know that every 2 to 4 hours, we want a hit of protein. Now, depending on what research you look at, a hit of protein currently stands at around 20 to 40 grams, but I'm fully aware that by the time this podcast episode goes out, there's going to be a couple more research papers that kind of maybe debunk that slightly or show that that's maybe not the most optimal. But for now, that's where the research is currently at. So 20 to 40 grams of protein, that's the number we need to aim for effectively. Doing that through a plant-based just requires a bit more thinking and kind of execution, I suppose. Now, through normal meat eaters and standard kind of dietary eating, quite easy to go out, well, I'm going to have a chicken breast there, I'm going to have a piece of salmon there, I'm going to have a chocolate milkshake here, I'm going to have a high protein, squeezy pouch yogurt there, and that's my protein hit for the day. But when we come to plant-based, we have to start thinking of different foods. Yes, we can eat tofu, but we don't want tofu at every single meal. Or is it tempeh as well? It's like another version of that that's like the fake chicken almost. And the challenge is where do I find it from elsewhere? Well, beans contain high amount of proteins. So whether that's a kidney bean, a red bean, whether that's chickpeas, for example, edamame beans have got loads of different good nutrients in, as well as also having the protein requirements needed. There's a lot of milks as well, so soy milk, etc., that are, or pea protein milk, that are really good in terms of getting protein intake in. Again, we just have to be smart. There's a lot of soy-based yogurts that we can have as opposed to kind of dairy-based products that will also still help with our calcium uptake, which will help with the strength of our bones. But ultimately, it's just about being smart. I think the first thing we do when an athlete goes vegan is panic that their protein intake is going to drop. Naturally, it will slightly. What we have to do is just find foods that can replace that. The challenge then comes with eating more beans, eating more greens, and the high fibrous nature of that often causes a little bit more gastrointestinal discomfort to begin with, because our bodies aren't used to shoveling so many plants into the body that it becomes unnatural. And actually that much fiber is good for us, but also it is going to cause potentially the requirement to go to the toilet more often. So in and around fixtures and training and matches, we've got to be careful in terms of when we plan our foods so that we don't need to run off and go to the toilet during that time. But protein's quite easy to hit as long as we go down the right routes from there. I think it's sometimes some of the vitamins and minerals that we struggle with more so.
I was smiling because you answered my next question.
Cool.
So with beans and stuff,
Yeah.
like you say, the high fiber, so they can be a challenge around match day, etc. Something else, maybe nuts and seeds are also considered protein sources for plant-based diets. These can be high in fat.
Absolutely, yeah.
Does this also present challenge around match days, training, long runs, whatever that might be? And how do we overcome them challenges if you want to, hit some protein before you go out for a run or for a match? What sources are we going to look at from a plant-based perspective that are not going to be high in fibre or high in fat and cause that GI distress?
Yeah, and that's the thing is I think fats we tiptoe around in sport quite often because we know they take longer to digest. Yeah, so one of the big challenges is often with fats that they take a lot longer to digest. So as you said about the GI distress or discomfort, is that high fat foods are often like really favoured by the body because they have more calories per gram. So typically speaking, a carb and a protein per gram of carb and protein will be about 4 calories. Whereas with fats, we're looking per gram to have 9 calories. So as a body that's wanting more energy at all times to be able to survive, they're going to sway more towards digesting fats quicker to store them. As a runner that's long distance, that's not a problem because we're probably going to burn through a lot of fats during that run because we know after kind of 60 to 90 minutes, we'll deplete our entire kind of carb or majority of our carb stores or our glycogen stores as they're known in our liver and our muscles, which will ultimately mean that we'll switch over or at least use more fats as an energy substrate to support our performance as a runner in a long distance capacity. Whereas if we look at shorter distance runners or potentially rugby training that might last in nature 60 minutes, we are going to need more carbs to promote better performance. If we load the body with lots of fats, they're going to become pretty useless in that first 60 minutes and might impact our energy or potentially we'll still spend time digesting them. So I think as a plant-based or somebody who's plant-based that's looking to eat them, trying to limit fats 3 hours before training and then obviously have them post-training where possible. A lot of the times I see, athletes forgetting like what fats are almost. So like peanut butter is still a fat. If we're looking at avocado, for example, as a breakfast option, it's still a fat source. Yes, healthy, eggs, still a healthy fat source. But ultimately, we don't want that directly before training. So it's whether we could go, if we're having a slice of toast, for example, and we normally have peanut butter, and whether we go for jam and a sliced banana on top of it, for example, that's going to give us more carbs as opposed to more fats. And I think one of the bigger challenge really for plant-based eating, as we've covered protein, is probably some of the vitamins and minerals that we find a lot of athletes become deficient in really because of, I suppose, the different style of eating that they take.
Well, let's jump into that.
Okay.
Let's have a chat about some of the potential micronutrient deficiencies someone might be at risk of taking on a plant-based diet if they're doing it incorrectly or they're uneducated, because I believe it is possible to get all, your macros, your micros in, but it's got to be done smart and by someone who knows what they're talking about. So talk us through some of the potential deficiency risks.
So no, I think you're correct in terms of the deficiencies from a vitamin and mineral standpoint, and especially when they're slightly uneducated. The big one for me is, as we've touched on already, is calcium. So from a calcium perspective, what I find is the lack of dairy products decreases the opportunity for calcium. Now, calcium doesn't just come through dairy-based products. There's multiple different products on the shelves in supermarkets, soy-based products, some of our fruit and veg that contain calcium, but nowhere near to the levels of what we find in kind of, like, I suppose, non-plant-based milks, cheeses, yogurts, etc. So often calcium can become one of those factors where we just have to spend more time being mindful around the consumption of it. It's not typically that we'll go down the route of a calcium-based supplement. It's more about the fact that we just look at certain products that contain higher amounts of calcium in. Similarly with iron. Iron's one of the big ones that we get from red meat. Obviously, removing red meat in a plant-based diet is going to contribute towards the reduction of iron, specifically in female athletes that we know need a higher percentage of iron available in the body due to menstrual cycle and monthly bleeds. Then we're going to need to be able to find that elsewhere in either another source of, I suppose, kind of, I suppose, food. So looking towards our spinaches, our broccoli, and those kind of foods, and nuts as well, are going to really help us with and seeds with our iron intake. But often, if we're an athlete that already contains or possesses low iron, we may need to look to supplement that. So that's where we start talking about supplements. Similarly, we know that calcium and vitamin D have a direct correlation with their ability to absorb. And in the winter months, as we're presented with the lovely sun actually outside today in Manchester, which I'm very impressed with, because normally every time I come here it's raining. And as I was driving home through here from St Helens last night, it was chucking it down and it was awful. In the winter months, we know that most athletes or most people will be vitamin D deficient. Now, there's two reasons for that. One, shorter span of sun during the day, and 80% of our vitamin D comes through sun. And I suppose secondly, when we do go outside, it's normally coats on, hats on, scarves on, because it's 2.5 degrees outside today, and we're not going out in t-shirts and shorts, absorbing all of that vitamin D from the sun through our skin. And the UV levels are a lot lower as well, which then causes obviously less Vit D. Now, that's a problem regardless of a plant-based or a kind of eating a normal kind of intake of food, of meats, etc. But the correlation with calcium is interesting, because if we don't have that calcium available to absorb, the challenge is then going to be that if we aren't then putting the vitamin D in to support the absorption of calcium, we're even like almost kind of uppercutting ourselves and giving ourselves a left hook at the same time when it comes to bone health. So the key is to firstly focus on and prioritize calcium-based foods, and then support yourself with a vitamin D supplement to enhance the absorption of the calcium that is going into the body. And I think it's so important that we manage those three of calcium, iron, and vitamin D, because they're probably the three big ones really that I don't want to call it a struggle, because if we're smart in the way that we eat our foods and we're clever with the types of foods and meals that we put together, it isn't a struggle. It's just about being more mindful around the products that we pick up off the shelf and ensuring that they've got the nutrients in that we require for an optimal plant-based eater.
I like it. You answered my next question, which was going to be about the interaction between calcium and vitamin D. So thank you for covering that. I guess, what are the vitamin D requirements for, let's say, just general population, because it can get a bit... The numbers are quite skewed for athletes, and the big reason for that is bone health, really. Like, vitamin D is going to contribute towards bone health and reducing the risk of injuries, and also play a little bit of a part in immune support as well, and supporting our immune function. So in athletes that go through a lot of bone stresses day-to-day in training, but also in match play, or runners, for example, that also have a lot of load going through their bodies when they're running, ultimately are gonna struggle if they haven't got optimal vitamin D levels. Now, if we're talking about general population, off the top of my head, and again, we might need to put little asterisks in the video, I think it's somewhere between 600 and 800 international units is what it's measured off of vitamin D per day. If we look at athletes, that can range anywhere between 1,000 to 4,000 international units per day. Normally, when we look at a healthy athlete that isn't necessarily deficient, but potentially requiring the top-up of supplements, and again, we test vitamin D through blood samples, and that gives us a good understanding of who's on high vitamin D and who's on kind of your standard dose. I'd look more to around kind of that 6,000 to 12,000 international units per week. So that might be 6 days a week supplementation of a 1,000 international units or a 2,000 international units tablet
per day, and obviously one day where maybe they're not in training or on site where they're maybe not consuming it. And I think what it does is it starts to alleviate some of the bone-based injuries that we find in sport. And we rolled this out with one of the younger year groups at one of the clubs that I work at, and we pulled a bit of budget together to actually provide the parents, firstly with the education around why vitamin D is important and calcium uptake, and then secondly that actually here's the kind of the health-based, I suppose, supplement or vitamin that we're going to provide you to be able to support bone-based risk of injury. And what we found, and it was quite anecdotal, we didn't measure it in terms of like percentages, but we found from a kind of eyesight and vision that a lot less athletes were coming down with bone-based stresses and small kind of, shin splints, kind of like back-related issues, etc., and hip avulsions, which are often kind of subject to bone-based injuries. So we kind of started to conclude in a very small, and again, being a published researcher, I know it's not the best way to go about kind of working it out, but through conversations with the team, realizing that actually what we're doing is somewhat effective. Now it might have been a fluke, but we ran that for the next 3 seasons and saw pretty much the same with that same age group moving through the years. So I think with vitamin D, the sole purpose of it is to support bone-based, I suppose, health and the uptake of calcium. And in terms of, I suppose, dosages, and like I said, I'm hoping I'm right with 600 to 800. I'll be Googling it after this. Yeah, got it completely wrong. Again, like I said, I spend a lot of time in the sports performance space and very little in the health space. So often a lot of my numbers are centered around what does a healthy athlete require, and typically it's somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000, depending on the vitamin D levels within the blood. And as I've said, the reason for that is mainly that injury risk factor that we look towards.
And do you practice what you preach?
I do, actually, believe it or not. I do. I actually buy my own vitamin D. I could quite easily steal it from a club that I work at, but me and the partner have our own little vitamin and mineral pill pots at home. In the winter months, I add vitamin C into there to try and avoid getting ill. Obviously, in my line of work, you don't want to be going into a club with an illness, because if you do, you're probably going to make a squad ill. And before you know it, you're the reason and the instigator that the whole squad's coming down with illness. So I always double down on my vitamin C, which helps to support immune function. I have a vitamin D in there, and then I also have an omega, because I'm not a massive fish eater. I have fish maybe once a week, so just to top up on my omega stores. So yeah, and I do actually have it in one of the little pots that are 7 days a week, and I try and make sure that I'm having the right amounts. The one thing I would say that I don't do that a professional athlete does is I don't go down the route of going to get a blood test to check that I've got the right levels. I just assume that over the winter months I'm going to require a vitamin D, because I spend most of my time indoors and away from the sun. So yeah, that's probably the only part that I practice what I preach 90%. It's the blood test that I miss out on, and it's only because they're fairly expensive. I try and avoid getting them as and when I don't need them.
And you're not looking to optimize, which is what some people can get wrong from maybe watching this. We're talking about athletes who are trying to get that 1% advantage.
Absolutely, yeah.
You don't have to wake up and have an electrolyte drink if you just not an athlete. If you're a normal person, you don't have to go and get your bloods done. Obviously, if you want to and do that, amazing. But we're talking about athletes that are trying to gain that edge, really, aren't we?
I think in the environment I find myself within, and I suppose living out my dream as wanting to be an athlete and never quite getting there, I think I still see myself as, what can I do to optimize, my running or my training? And, I'm not training for anything specifically, but I'd like to run and I like to go to the gym and take part in, sessions. So it's like, how can I use my knowledge to benefit myself and also be a bit of I suppose, not a role model, because that's probably a bit too high up, but showing that I'm doing the right actions and the right things, so that the athletes that I speak to, I don't feel fraudulent talking to them. If I'm kicking off at an athlete because they've not touched their morning pill pot with the vitamins and mineral pills in there that we've specifically designed for them because of a blood test, but then I've got a pill pot sat at home that has 7 days worth in that I've not touched for weeks because I've been too busy, which is normally their excuse, then I can't go at them to tell them that they need to do the right things. Or likewise in the morning, if I'm pulling, professional rugby players up or professional lacrosse players up for having a coffee first thing in the morning with the breakfast, when they wake up, when they're on a camp, and then I'm sat there with a coffee while I'm sipping the coffee telling them they shouldn't be having that, they should be having an electrolyte-based drink, and then going for the coffee 90 minutes later, I look very contradictory. So I think it's trying to almost, yes, like you say, some of this stuff is very kind of high-level 1%, but at the same time, I think there is elements and parts of it that we can build into our daily life just to optimize generally. You know, hydration is always going to be important, regardless whether you're an athlete or general population. Likewise, making sure our vitamin D levels are in the right place. Yes, we don't have to go get a blood test, but knowing what we know in the research from general population studies, that we don't get sun in the winter months. And I can't remember, when I lived in Manchester, I remember Googling it once, like, why does it rain so much in Manchester? And I think there was something like, I can't remember the percentage, but I think it was 21 more days on average per year in Manchester it rains than anywhere else in the country, which means rain equals clouds, which equals more vitamin D. So for yourself, probably need to be looking at some vitamin D to make sure that we're negating the rain and the clouds that we get more often in Manchester.
No, I'm not worried. I take it every day, so so I'm good. The other kind of one we talked about there was iron.
Yeah.
You know, as we exclude those red meats, we're also excluding, you know, kind of the main iron sources of the diet. But you said obviously we can look at getting the spinach and other things to get that iron source. Can you tell us the difference between heme and non-heme iron? And does that provide, is that challenging for plant-based athletes in terms of not only meeting the requirements, but the absorption side as well?
Absolutely. And I think the difficulty with iron is we can't split heme and non-heme in a single product and say, I'm going to take the heme and the non-heme out of certain products, which is where a supplement might come to fruition and be beneficial. And I think the challenge more so comes with female athletes, because realistically with male athletes, our requirements for iron are kind of a lot lower. So having those kind of non-heme and heme-based, I suppose, irons that we can just absorb and we can take in and hit our, I suppose, total iron requirement, it doesn't become a problem. But when we're looking at the absorption generally of iron for female athletes or just female general population, and the amount of iron that we dispel within the month because of, you know, like I say, the menstrual cycle, that's probably the bigger challenge. And I'd say probably, I don't know what the percentage would be of female athletes that already take an iron-based supplement, but if we're looking in rugby and running, quite often it is quite high. And the sole reason for that, especially even if they are meat eaters, is because their requirements are just too much to be able to find within foods there's enough absorbable iron within foods. Now, you do find a lot of foods, and it's the same with vitamin D, where they're fortified with iron. A lot of cereals are, but often they're quite difficult for the body to absorb because they're unnaturally placed within that product. Similarly with vitamin D, it might be fortified. You know, orange juice is a classic one, fortified with vitamin D, but the body would struggle to be able to absorb that. So I think from a plant-based eating female perspective, being quite specific there, an iron-based supplement's probably, you know, highly beneficial, regardless, similar to vitamin D, if we're going to get a blood test or not. Often symptoms of kind of low iron is often, you know, chronic fatigue, tiredness, and then obviously we can go down the route of kind of like longer term kind of symptoms of low iron. But if we start finding that chronic fatigue, often it means, and our body's quite good at signaling when we've got an issue. You know, I always speak to athletes about, you know, kind of if they're feeling tired consistently, and chronic fatigue isn't just I'm going to bed and I'm getting 6 hours sleep a night. It's falling asleep for 12 hours and waking up still feeling tired over a long period of time, i.e. chronically. And often that comes because of a deficiency. And it's our body screaming out to say, please have a look inside and tell me what's wrong, and please fill me with the right nutrients. And often it's vitamin D or it's iron that tends to be missing. In female athletes, more often than not, it's low iron. And I would recommend, like I say, if there's, you know, athletes looking to gain that 1%, going down the route of a blood test to test iron levels to be able to support the requirement and the rationale behind having that supplementation, I think is going to be really important as well.
Yeah, no, I like that. Not just doing it blindly, going, yeah, right, I've been told, let's take an iron supplement. Yeah. Like, it's important to go and actually see if you need that iron supplement. Absolutely. You know, and where your level's at, you might be deficient, but there's a difference between just being a little bit deficient in iron and, iron deficiency anemia, like the two different worlds essentially. So, you might need a higher dose, or you might be fine with what you're currently doing. So getting the rationale behind it, like you say, I think it is a really good approach. Cool. So we've talked a little bit about the benefits of supplementing if you're deficient and stuff like that. Tell us a little bit about supplement safety, because I see people all the time, buying the cheapest ones they can get their hands on, ordering stuff off TikTok shop, and not really understanding, like, maybe not the dangers, maybe the dangers if you're an athlete, but even for everyday people.
Absolutely. I think a great segue and something that I was hoping we'd come to speak to on the pod after discussing supplements. I think without discussing food first, but not food first, but not food only, and then also some of the supplements that we might include from specifically a plant-based, I suppose, diet, and then some of the ones we debunked, like creatine and protein. We have to be safe with our supplement usage. A study back in, I think, 2014, which I know is very outdated now to say that this is 10 years on, showed that in the supplement market of those products that weren't tested and were unregulated almost and put on the shelves in, high street supermarkets, there was around 18.6% that had prohibited or contaminated substances in, which could cause an athlete to be barred from the sport. And, we're talking kind of, the standard stuff that you see on the shelves. It's not some, black market stuff that you go and get from under a counter. This is like on a supermarket shelf often. And the reason for that is the supplement industry away from testing is very unregulated. So whether that's going on TikTok shop, as I know we discussed off camera, and buying our supplements from there because they're super cheap, or whether that's, going into a supermarket and they've got these, amazing weight loss pills or whatever might come of that. Ultimately, the regulation is so low in regards to releasing a supplement. I don't know whether it's changed in recent years, but I know when I was studying it that ultimately you could get away with putting a supplement on a shelf for 3 months without it being tested at all. So you could have absolutely anything pretty much within reason within that supplement, and then 3 months down the line could be the moment it gets tested and pulled from production, or it might have unsafe limits of, for example, caffeine's a classic one. I remember when I was a young rugby player, we'd always be looking, and again, probably not practicing what I preach now, but looking for the highest content caffeine in a supplement, and what was going to give us the biggest buzz, and often they'd end up disappearing off the market because the caffeine levels within them were unsafe. Like as a young kid, we were like, oh, they've ruined our fun of really pushing for big rugby sessions or training sessions. And the good thing is, and I suppose the kind of light at the end of the tunnel is, there's a really good system in place in the UK around testing supplements and supplement quality called Informed Sport. So what Informed Sport do is they test or they batch test supplements, and they batch test every single batch. So it's not a case of that supplement gets tested once, they're allowed to go and manufacture it for the next 4 or 5 years, and then they get tested again. Every single batch that's produced, so in a big silo, when it's going into the bags, a sample is taken and then tested to ensure that it's got no harmful chemicals, prohibited substances, or anything that's going to get an athlete barred in sport going within those bags of, let's say, protein, or, if they're small kind of capsules of vitamin D, making sure that they're all safe. And then when that company goes to produce its next batch of products, it'll then get tested again. So every single batch will get tested. And the beauty of that, I suppose, is that, as an athlete or even an individual that's recreationally taking part in sports, that you're not putting anything bad in your body or not risking any contamination within the body. What you've got to understand, we've spoke a lot about maybe not needing protein and creatine, but actually we spoke a lot about maybe needing vitamins and minerals, is often vitamins and minerals are considered a pharmaceutical product. And if we don't buy them from a kind of sports nutrition supplement-based Informed Sport, space, we don't know what's been produced alongside those, the vitamin D pills, for example. There might be some, harmful drug that is right next door to it, that all it takes is one human error and you get a cross-contamination of products. Now, I've not seen that happen in my experience, and I imagine we do have some regulation over that, and companies that produce those things will do, but to 100% show kind of safety, opting for Informed Sport. And the easiest way to tell whether a product is informed sport, and this is where I think the market gets it right in sports nutrition, is they put the actual logo. It's almost a badge of honor for the company to be able to say that their product is informed sport. So you'll notice on certain brands and certain products there will be the little informed sport logo, and often if we can't find that and it says that it's certified in informed sport, you can take the batch number, go online at, I think it's informsport.com or .co.uk, and quite literally type in that batch code, and it'll come up as to when the batch was first created and when it would expire. Now, if it's beyond its expiry date, we know not to take that product. If there's been a mess up at the factory and they've stamped the wrong batch on the codes, for example, but we know that if that's within the expiry date of the batch number, that product and that bag that you've got will have had a sample out of the full batch tested for anything harmful. So I think, yeah, if we're going to opt for supplements for whatever reason that might be, and whether we are, a professional athlete or we're an academy level athlete, or even if we're just a recreational athlete, granted, we don't get tested as recreational athletes, and academy and professional athletes need to be a bit more considerate that people will come in and test. But I think just from a general well-being and safety point of view, opting for informed sport is always going to be more beneficial than taking that small chance, or as we saw back in 2014 with the prevalence data, an 18% chance of it having something prohibited within that. And that's where, like you said earlier, I think off camera, we were talking about TikTok Shop and the unregulation of that market. And thankfully, I've not made it to TikTok yet. I did have, I think, a TikTok page for all part of 3 or 4 weeks, and then just couldn't get into it and stuck to Instagram Reels. But even on my page as a nutritionist, I was getting shown all kinds of products, and again, promoted by people who weren't in the nutrition space. There might be like beauty-based brands that are then suddenly, switching market to try and use TikTok Shop as a revenue income, and trying to, of course, they're going to tell you about all the benefits of the product that's at the bottom of the page because they want you to buy it. They might not even be taking that product, but it might be that they're pretending to, hoping that they can influence an audience that are going to take it. So obviously stay clear of those kind of areas, I think, is the big message and take-home message from that.
Yeah. No, that's really useful. And what are some of the common retailers that are stocking informed sport supplements?
So I'd say the best place to go to get informed sport is direct to the actual brand itself, because you just know that you're definitely getting an informed sport product. Sometimes, for example, there is brands that will do both. They'll do non-informed sport because they're cheaper to produce, as you said earlier. Often it is the cheap products that aren't informed sport, and you pay a bit of a premium to get hold of something that's informed sport. So the challenge then becomes, if we walk into Tesco or Holland and Barrett's or any other kind of retailer like that stocks a variety of supplements, you're going to see a mixture on the shelves of informed sport products and non-informed sport products. And all it takes is to go in there and look at the Optimum Nutrition Elite range next to the normal Optimum Nutrition range and accidentally pick up the wrong tub. Now, I'm not saying Optimum Nutrition non-informed sport would have any harmful stuff in, but we run the risk regardless of where we buy it from. So I'd say go into a reputable sports nutrition company, so your likes of like SIS, Nutrition X, Vita Sport, those kind of brands that their whole website is pretty much informed sport. You know that wherever you click, you're going to get a product that's batch tested. I know My Protein back in the day, I don't know whether they still do it, used to do an elite range that was more expensive. I know Bulk Powders used to do or Bulk they're called now, aren't they? They used to do I think it was called the Black Edition range, and that was informed sport. But I think companies like them who generally deliver to the mass market of gym users pulled out of sport a little bit and removed the elite range because of, firstly, the cost. They wanted to keep the protein per serving as low as possible, and realized the elite range wasn't quite doing it in terms of people weren't switching towards that. So again, looking on websites like My Protein or Bulk that are really good for cheap protein, 9 times out of 10 their products aren't going to be informed sport, and from what I've looked at recently. So trying to see what some of the pro athletes are using as well. So the classic one I always say is that have a look at what your local rugby clubs or football clubs have got as their sponsors, because typically, or all the time, they won't go with somebody who isn't informed sport. So their actual reason for partnering with a certain brand is yes, commercial, but also they wouldn't just go and partner with a supplement company that isn't informed sport, because the athletes won't be able to use them from there.
Yeah, no, that's really good to know, because I imagine there's a lot of people out there now buying very cheap stuff, and probably a lot of the younger generation now get their information from social media, so helping us get that knowledge out, I think, is really important. 100%. Now I just want to kind of switch to considering someone who's, either thinking about or going to adopt a plant-based diet as we've defined it in this episode, and some of the challenges that they might face we've covered. Yeah. So what advice do you have for someone who's going to try and adopt that plant-based diet?
Yeah, I think don't do it as an impulse decision. Like, have your reasonings behind it. If the reasoning is performance, then we're doing it for the wrong reasons. If the reason you want to adopt a plant-based diet is for morals or, your kind of ethics around kind of the treatment of animals, for example, or potentially that, you maybe don't like the taste of meat or you've gone off meat, for example, then absolutely fine to kind of go down that route. I think if we see another athlete that's plant-based, then all of a sudden we assume that we're going to become that athlete. If we go plant-based, as we discussed earlier with the rugby lads and talking about them just coming in with plant-based foods because one player decided to do it after watching a documentary, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. So first and foremost, make sure that your reason is strong. Now, most athletes that I work with will almost try and convince themselves, I think, that they are wanting to go plant-based because of certain reasons, and then at the weekend I ended up having a steak, or at the weekend I fancied a Domino's and I couldn't be bothered getting the vegan one with the vegan cheese, so I just got normal Domino's. And it's got to be like a lifestyle choice that you make as opposed to just fluttering between the two. Don't get me wrong, if you want to do meat-free days for an environmental reason, then absolutely fine, but again, make sure we're planned and prepared leading into that. And I think preparing is key. So we've spoke a lot about, I don't want to call them the dangers of plant-based eating, but the concerns or the areas of nutrition that we might need to put more emphasis on. Make sure, firstly, you've watched back this episode because that will give you some of those areas that will help you. But secondly, go and do a bit of research. So what foods do you like that are high in iron? What foods do you like that are going to replace protein intake? Maybe trial it for a week first and foremost. See how we get on. Again, we've spoke about the GI discomfort with the higher fibre. Know that that's going to be a thing. And actually, if we're prepared for that, if we're in the middle of a competition season, so like a runner, for example, that's got maybe a marathon coming up or maybe a few 5Ks coming up, depending on the style of runner, the challenge is then going to be, are we going to be optimal for that specific race? It might be something of a decision that if we're happy to take it a bit more lightly, doing it during the off season, and then bringing it into the pre-season and the season. Or as a runner, it might be that we do it when we're on non-competition training as opposed to comp training. If we're tapering down to a specific event as a runner, then it's going to be a challenge to suddenly just click our fingers and change our kind of food intake and assume that everything's going to stay exactly the same. The body's going to react differently for everybody that kind of opts towards a plant-based diet. So being mindful of that first and foremost, but then also setting that plan in place that you've got the kind of contingency of protein. So, as opposed to me and you walking out of here and going, we're going to be plant-based eaters now, and then I'm going to go and buy a bag of spinach for lunch, and I'm going to get rid of my Coronation chicken sub that I've got sat in the car for lunch. A quick on-the-go shout that was, by the way. I didn't prepare my meal prep as I normally would today.
What a nutritionist eats
in
a day.
My Coronation chicken sub is what I've gone for today, with the 2 boiled eggs options for a little bit of an increase in protein. But again, none of that's plant-based. So if I suddenly binned that off, went back over to the Tesco over the road, didn't bother looking at the plant-based specific foods and went, right, what's plant-based here? Right, I'll have a fruit pot and I'll grab maybe a kind of Caesar salad, but not use the Caesar sauce because it's not plant-based. And all of a sudden I'm just eating leaves and fruit. Then I'm going to feel pretty hungry come my tea time and actually probably give up on being a plant-based eater. So although a lot of the recommendations aren't there to put you off being a plant-based eater, I think it's more about the sustainability of it. So if we can find that kind of smooth transition towards being plant-based eating, if that's what we want to do, as I said, morally and ethically, if we want to go down that route, it's just making sure we've got the contingency plan in place so that nothing changes in terms of our macro micronutrients, so our carbs, fats, proteins, and then those key vitamins and minerals that we've discussed in regards to making sure that we kind of have them available within plant-based foods.
Yeah, so it sounds like preparation and knowledge is key. Something you said there, do your research on what's high in protein, iron that I might enjoy. Where do people do this research?
So often people do the research in the wrong areas. So they'll go on Instagram and they'll start searching like vegan or vegetarian. I think for me, we're very fixed on social media being a platform of good knowledge, whereas a lot of the times it isn't. So I think going online, reading through articles, there's often some really good infographics as well. If we go onto like Google Images, that'll give us and spit out a lot of information at us, and often quite factually correct, especially if it's being created by a nutritionist with a reputable kind of, I suppose, source. Reaching out to some of the smaller nutrition practitioners, you're not going to hear back from those that have got millions of followers. But if you find a nutritionist that's working in sport who is potentially, working with a couple of clubs, not many followers, often you can get a response from them in terms of any questions. I'm certainly one of those, nutritionists that doesn't have a big platform, but I have it there as just a bit of an accountability tool, really. But I get a lot of questions, not necessarily around plant-based eating, but around all kinds of nutrition. And when I see them, I'm happy to answer because, I'm not somebody who's got an inundated inbox of hundreds, thousands of people trying to contact me. And I think use Google to your advantage because you know a good and a bad website. Now, the information that you're looking for isn't opinion, it's fact. You're trying to find out what foods are high in protein. Likelihood is people aren't going to lie on an article about what foods are high in protein, for example. So going on that article and having a look at the list of foods that they provide, but maybe the spiel above that might be around like different sources of protein and that you don't get complete proteins through vegetarian or vegan options versus incomplete and whatever it might be. Ignore that bit and just go to the factual bit that you want to actually look at, like, right, where's my list of shopping effectively as a plant-based eater. And I think that's probably a good starting foundation to be able to lead into if we're considering a plant-based kind of diet from now on.
And this is the last question on this section.
Yeah.
So pre and post session, whether that's as a rugby player or runner, we're looking at some plant-based recommendations that are going to help us perform.
Yeah. What are we
eating?
Much,
what are we eating?
So in terms of what we'd want to eat, wouldn't change whether we're, I suppose, plant-based or just eating as normal, because the requirements of macronutrients are still the same. And again, this is where research comes into play in terms of doing your own research, finding the foods that are going to be beneficial for you. So typically speaking, 2 to 3 hours before a training session or a match or a long run as a runner, whether a rugby player or a runner, we want to look towards having something that's high in carbohydrates with a small amount of protein, some fats and some fruit and veg. So we pictured that on kind of a visual plate. 50% of our plate would be made up of carbohydrates, and then a quarter would be made up of fats and proteins, obviously fats being the smaller sliver of the two, and then the other quarter would be made up of our fruit and veg. So that would be our kind of pre-training plate that we'd have maybe 2 to 3 hours before. Now the next question, and maybe people watching this might be thinking, well, 2 hours and then training, I'm going to be so hungry by the time I get to my training session. So it's looking for some form of snacks that you can fill those 2 hours with. Try not to eat anything before 30 minutes before the session to allow for digestion, but it might be that we chuck in, if we're from home, a small slice of toast or a bagel 90 minutes before, and then 60 minutes before a cereal bar, a fresh piece of fruit, something along those lines. Now, regardless whether we're vegan or plant-based or a vegetarian or a kind of meat eater or a normal eating of food, that meal's consistency and the style isn't going to change. But making sure, for example, as a plant-based eater, we spoke about the struggles of protein, that you've got a good protein source within that meal. And likewise, after training, most athletes would sat here listening to this and think that we need more protein post-training. But if we were intently listening earlier, we were talking about how we need 20 to 40 grams every kind of 2 to 3 hours in like a space of like 4 to 5 hits of protein in the day to support that growth and generation, or as I called it in the science word, muscle protein synthesis. So if we know that, and we know that more protein after training doesn't equal better recovery, then it's quite wasteful to go really high in protein. And I suppose as a plant-based eater, you might see that as a positive, because we don't have to suddenly start finding all these sources of protein that aren't meat-based. So it makes your life a lot easier. We just keep the same sized amount of protein post-training as what we would pre-training. The emphasis, which actually probably benefits a plant-based eater more, is more fruit and veg. So 50% of it, if we think of it on a plate again, 50% of our plate made of fruit and veg, so more vitamins and minerals going into the body to support recovery. Our fats and protein make up that quarter, and then of course carbs make up a quarter as well. So in terms of like putting training in the middle, 3 hours before or 2 to 3 hours before last big meal, 90 minutes, 60 minutes before some form of snack, and then as soon as possible we're going to have that meal or that snack that consists of high fruit and veg, same amount of protein, and then slightly lower carbs as a recovery meal. And I think one of the big common misconceptions when it comes to post-training food, and a myth that I'm conscious that we've got some myth busting, so maybe jumping the gun, is do we need to have food within 30 minutes, the 30-minute recovery window? And arguably yes, but there is a little bit of a but with that, because when we think about recovery, yes, we want to have food as soon as possible after training where possible, because what that'll do is that will kickstart our recovery phase. And if we leave it, let's say, 4 hours before having any food as opposed to 30 minutes, our recovery or optimal recovery window won't start until 4 hours after training, which might delay our ability to return at full recovery and might add 4 hours to that recovery. Whereas if we eat within that 30-minute window, it's optimal. It's not necessarily needed. We're not going to lose our ability to recover if we don't eat within that 30 minutes. What it'll do is it'll give us an opportunity to be able to start recovering almost instantaneously after the session, after the match, that's gonna see us through into that next day to be able to support kind of full recovery ready for the next session.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping I've not stolen
myth
there.
No.
That was a bonus myth buster there. Then for us.
A bonus one. I am conscious of time, so I want to jump straight into this next section. So as I said before, this is a myth busting section. With nutrition information, there's always a lot of myths floating around. So I've come up with a few. We're going to go through them with Dan, and he's going to tell us if they're a myth or there's some truth to them, or maybe there's somewhere in between. We don't know. So number one, which I think we've kind of covered, you can't get enough protein on a plant-based diet.
Great myth. Absolutely myth. Not fact. False. I think we've discussed it in length today about it's just about being protein smart. I think we could coin the term, and making sure that we have a surplus of different protein options that are plant-based to our disposal, because it's not as readily available as what general protein is, typically speaking.
You will lose muscle on a plant-based diet.
Oh, great myth as well. So in terms of busting that, again, what we have to remember is where that comes from, which is can't get protein in, and we're eating more veg-based options as opposed to eating more carbohydrates, maybe because we think that we need more plants in a plant-based diet. If our protein requirements, as we've discussed earlier, our gram per kilogram requirements are being met in a capacity of plant-based protein, no problem with kind of degrading muscle mass. And if we maintain our carb intake, which most carb sources haven't got any kind of meat or non-plant-based foods in, so we shouldn't struggle with switching out our carb sources, then absolutely we'll maintain our mass. We won't lose weight. The only way to lose weight is obviously being in a calorie deficit, and that tends to happen easier for a plant-based eater because they'll tend to shift more towards fruit and veg as an option for food, knowing that it's completely plant-based. Whereas if we're just smart with our carb intake and our protein intake, we won't lose weight. And if we wanted to lose weight, then it might seem easier because there's more options that help us lose weight. But if we don't want to, we don't have to lose weight. Okay,
great. Plant-based diets enhance athletic performance.
Again, I feel like we're just going to go myth here. Is a myth. I will throw a curveball in and say there is some element of truth. I think the one thing plant-based diets do that don't get enough credit is it sets a rule for an athlete. Similarly with fasting, it's one of those things where we know that fasting doesn't equal weight loss. It's the calorie restriction during the fast that equals weight loss. And if we set a rule that we're only eating in a 4-hour window, the rest of the time we don't consume all the junk that we usually would. So similarly with plant-based eating, it doesn't enhance athletic performance. If we took two athletes, one that ate really well as a normal meat-eating diet and one that was a plant-based and ate really well, they'd perform and athletically be equivocal to each other. The challenge comes that the person that's eating plant-based has a few more rules in place. They can't go and grab a bag of Cadbury's chocolate at 10 o'clock at night and just eat them, or a bag of Haribos because there's gelatin in them. Whereas somebody who's non-plant-based might be able to go and sneak in the cupboard and grab more stuff. So the options are normally healthier, which then results better athletic performance. But somebody who's non-plant-based can still be as athletic as somebody who's plant-based. It's just about ensuring that they stay clear of some of those cues to go and eat loads of chocolate, sweets and crisps.
Love it. One you've just answered. Plant-based diets help you lose weight. Quick question. How do people lose weight? Is it the diet or is it the calorie deficit?
It's absolutely the latter, the calorie deficit. If we're thinking about energy balance, and this is where athletes have to be careful as well, because losing too much weight or rapid weight loss over a short space of time is going to be negative towards performance. Likewise, the opposite side, putting on too much weight too quickly is going to be negative to performance. So it's managing it in a way that's going to be, I suppose, safe and beneficial to an athlete. So plant-based foods don't specifically help you lose weight. It's the way in which we eat. And similarly, if we put any rule in place, so fasting, plant-based diets, whatever that rule might be, seems to make it easier to lose weight because we've got a set of rules in place. But if we took normal eating and set some rules around a calorie deficit, i.e. eating less food than what we're expending, we're going to find a general trend of weight loss. Now, for different athletes, and I get this question quite a lot from parents, is I want my son, who's a rugby player, I want him to lose a bit of weight and maintain his muscle. What calories does he need per day? It's so individualized on activity, on especially young athletes, on maturation and growth, and also looking at their day-to-day habits and activities. So like, yes, we can factor in training, but they might be at a college where they're doing a lot of sport and physical work. They might be in an office where they're sat doing not a lot. So it's so individual that in a podcast it'd be very difficult to say this is how you lose weight. But ultimately, the myth comes from the fact that the rules that are set around plant-based eating makes it slightly easier for our brain to comprehend how to lose weight. Whereas if we've got no rules, we can break that quite easy and become a bit of a binger on certain foods if we're over-restricting.
Yeah, love it. A plant-based diet helps you detox your body. Sorry, I can't help myself.
So I think the smile and the laugh is probably giving away that that's a big myth. Detox is such a word, and I think it sits very much in the health space, and every now and again creeps over to the sports performance side. I hear a few athletes saying, I'm on a detox, or they've bought some certain herbal teas to detox, or whatever it might be. Now, for me, we should never need to detox the body. It's something that if we're consuming the right types of foods in the right proportions, then there's no real need to detox. I think sometimes that is true to some people in terms of they want to reset, and maybe they're in a really bad place of eating where they're consistently in a cycle of binging. So it might be that they spend all week trying to be really healthy, and at the weekend they go out and binge on all kinds of foods because they've over suppressed during the week. Now, instead of adopting a plant-based diet, because as we said earlier, we shouldn't be doing that for the wrong reasons, we should be doing it for the right reasons. For me, adopt something like an 80-20 rule. If we need a rule to put in place, the 80-20 rule kind of kills all. It's 80% of the time, all the good foods that, nutritionists will talk about, and then 20% of the time, allow yourself that time for the fun foods. And I call them the fun foods, not the unhealthy foods, because unless it creeps over 20%, that's when they become unhealthy. And even if you look at the Eat Well plate that is obviously well known, taught in schools, government guidance of how to eat, you'll see that big wheel in the middle of all of the split sections is your 80%. And you'll notice, depending on which way you're looking around it, at the bottom left-hand corner, there is actually pictures of like Coca-Cola, chocolate, crisps, and it'll say eat less often and in smaller amounts. That's your 20% over in that corner. So even if we're watching this and we're not an athlete, I think it's so important that we know how to manage the kind of food intake to support the detox in a way. And if we just opt for an 80-20 approach, as opposed to trying an extreme diet, we're not going to fail because it's quite an easier approach than switching up our whole cupboards of foods that we've got. But also it'll help us feel healthier as opposed to trying to detox and then being unhealthy again for ages and then detoxing again.
Yeah. No, that is all the myth-busting sections. You heard it here first. I think every one of them was a myth.
Yeah, I don't think we had a truth in that, which is probably a good depiction of the nutrition industry at the minute, with how many myths there are out there at the minute.
100%, but it's always good to get, your expertise on this to kind of educate people, because as we said, there's a lot of misinformation out there. I'm trying to put some real truth out there, and I think that was just that. So obviously we'll close off now. I'm conscious of, you've got to be up and down in different places. You've got one-to-ones back to back. Just tell us a little bit about the services you offer and where can people find you?
So I think service-wise, I suppose mainly offering in the professional sports space. So a lot of what I do is consultancy within sport from an education standpoint, but also from a, I suppose, professional sports standpoint, offering, as we said earlier, one-to-ones, workshops, parent, coach, catch-ups, etc., and just delivering across that space more so. I have dived into the health space and corporate industry as well, delivering talks. I think there's a really nice marry-up of sports nutrition and high-performing corporate positions, and I've done quite a lot of work of bringing what we know in professional sports into, I suppose, the corporate space and helping people develop as individuals by adopting like a professional sports mindset within their careers themselves. In terms of where to find me, I think best place is always Instagram, which is at DRN Nutrition. Probably a world's exclusive of what DRN Nutrition stands for. It quite literally is Dan Richardson Nutrition. But it seems to have just stuck because DR Nutrition looks like I'm trying to be a doctor, which I'm absolutely not in nutrition. I've only got a master's degree, not a PhD. So yeah, DRN Nutrition on Instagram is probably the best place to find me, or on our website, which is www.drnnutrition.co.uk. If you ever want to reach out or ask any questions. And I think opening the floor a little bit to those watching, that if they have a myth that they want answering, more than happy to receive a DM, and they can kind of have it debunked in real life for them, as opposed to just watching the ones we've uncovered today as we've spoke today.
No, love that. So all of the links will be in the description below. Thank you for coming on today.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Thanks for driving down. I appreciate your time, and thanks for sharing your knowledge, because this is going to help a lot of people. So I appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers, Dan.